The first rays of sunlight pierced through the cracks in the wooden boards like accusing fingers, reminding me exactly where I was and why I was there. I woke up stiff from the cold, curled up on the dirt floor, with only an old shawl I had brought in my suitcase. My 67-year-old bones protested when I tried to stand up, but the physical pain was nothing compared to the wound I carried in my heart. "Good morning, Evelyn," I said to myself out loud just to hear a human voice in that silence that was suffocating me. "Welcome to your new home." The words sounded hollow, like a cruel joke that nobody understood. I stepped out of the shack to explore what was now my property. The morning was crisp and the mountain air filled my lungs. I have to admit that despite everything, there was a strange beauty in this place. The pine trees stood tall like silent guardians, and in the distance you could see the mountains covered in mist like a gray blanket. But the beauty did not cover up the raw reality. I had no water, I had no electricity, I had no food, and most painful of all, I had no family. I started walking around the shack trying to understand why Arthur would have left me this place. It was bigger than I had thought the night before. There was a small abandoned vegetable garden where you could still see the remains of tomato plants and peppers. There was a dry well with a rusted water pump. And there was something else. Behind the shack, half hidden among the weeds, I found a small structure that looked like a shed or a workshop. The door was locked with an old padlock, but the hinges were so rusted that with a little bit of force I managed to open it. Inside it was dark and smelled of dampness and time. When my eyes adjusted to the gloom, I saw old tools, empty cans, and in one corner, something that made me stop dead in my tracks, a wooden desk with drawers. My heart started beating faster. Arthur had a desk just like this in his study back at the house. He always kept it locked and said he kept important work papers in there. He never let me open it. With trembling hands, I pulled on the first drawer. It was stuck, but after several attempts, it opened with a groan. Inside there were yellowed papers, old photographs, and letters. I took one of the letters and brought it closer to the light, filtering through the door. The handwriting was Arthur's, but younger, more careless. It was dated 25 years ago, and it said, "My dearest Evelyn, if you are reading this, it is because I am no longer with you. Forgive me for the secrets I kept. Forgive me for the lies I had to tell. But above all, forgive me for not telling you sooner who I really am." My breath caught in my throat. Who was he really? What secrets was he talking about Arthur, and I had been married for 40 years? How could there be secrets that big? I continued reading. This property is not just an abandoned shack. It is the place where it all began, where my true family lived before everything was lost. Robert does not know it, but this land is worth more than the entire fortune he inherited. Much more. My hands started shaking so much that I almost dropped the letter. More than $15 million. How was that possible? I looked for more letters, but there was something else that caught my attention. A black and white photograph. In it, Arthur appeared, but much younger, maybe about 30 years old. He was standing next to 3 other men in front of what looked like a mine. They were all wearing hard hats and smiling. On the back of the photo, in Arthur's handwriting, it said, "Partners of the St. Helen Mine, 1978. Partners of a mine." Arthur had never spoken to me about any mine. He worked at an insurance office. At least that is what he had told me all these years. I kept going through the papers. There were documents I did not understand well, with large numbers and official seals. There were maps of the area with strange markings. And there were more photographs of Arthur with different people I had never seen in my life. In one of the more recent photos, Arthur appeared next to an elegant, well-dressed man who looked familiar to me. On the back it said, "With Mr. Edward. The truth about Robert, 2019. The truth about Robert." What truth was he talking about? My mind started spinning like a top. Who really was the man I had lived with for 40 years? Why had he lied to me about his job, about his family, about his past, and more importantly, what did all this have to do with him leaving me abandoned in this place? My stomach growled, reminding me that I had not eaten anything since the day before. I tucked the papers into my shawl and walked to the nearest town. The sun was already high and the dirt road felt long to my tired legs. At Mr. Earl's General Store, an older man with a gray mustache who seemed to know the whole region. I bought the basics: bread, beans, eggs, coffee, some candles and matches. "Are you the new lady at the Harrison place?" he asked me while bagging my groceries. "The Harrisons?" I asked, confused. "No, sir, I am Evelyn Morris. I inherited the property from my late husband, Arthur Morris." Mr. Earl looked at me strangely. "Arthur Morris?" "No, ma'am. That property has always belonged to the Harrisons. Mr. Arthur Harrison was the owner, a very rich, very mysterious man. They said he had big businesses in the city." My blood ran cold. Harrison. My husband's last name was Morris. I was Evelyn Morris. What was this man talking about? "Excuse me, Mr. Earl, but there must be a mistake. My husband's name was Arthur Morris." The old man shook his head. "No, ma'am. I knew Mr. Arthur Harrison since he was young. He lived here until he went to the city to make his fortune. Then he would come back every now and then, always with new trucks and elegant people. The last time I saw him was about 5 years ago before he got sick." The ground moved beneath my feet. Had Arthur used a fake name with me for 40 years? Why, what else had he lied about? "And did you know his family, his wife?" I asked with a broken voice. Mr. Earl scratched his head. "Well, look, ma'am, Mr. Arthur never spoke much about his personal life, but many years ago, like in the 80s, he arrived here with a very young and very pretty girl. I think she was pregnant. After that, we never saw her again. Only he came all alone." A young, pregnant girl in the 80s. Robert had been born in 1985. "Do you remember what that girl looked like?" I asked him, although I already feared the answer. "Oh, ma'am, so many years have passed. But she was dark-haired, with long hair, very pretty, and she looked like she had money, not like the folks from town." I left the store walking like a sleepwalker. In my mind, pieces of a horrible puzzle were starting to connect. Arthur with a fake last name, a young and pregnant woman in the 80s, Robert born in 1985, and me, the fool, raising that boy as if he were my own son. When I arrived back at the shack, it was already getting dark. I lit a candle and took out the papers again. This time I read them with different eyes, looking for clues I had not seen before. And I found them. In one of the oldest letters Arthur had written, "Mary Ellen is pregnant. The baby will be born in the spring. Evelyn must never know the truth. She will raise him as her own, and I will be able to have both my son and my wife without losing either of them." The tears started falling on the yellowed paper. Mary Ellen. I had heard that name before. Arthur mentioned it sometimes when he had nightmares. I thought it was some childhood sweetheart who had died. But she had not died. She had been alive. She had a son with my husband, and I had been the fool who raised the mistress's son without knowing it. 40 years caring, loving, sacrificing myself for a child who was not mine. 40 years living a lie. 40 years being the stupid woman who did not realize her husband had another life, another family. That night I cried until I had no tears left. But between the pain and the rage, something was starting to change inside me. A question repeated in my mind like a hammer. If Arthur had lied to me about his name, about Robert, about his job, what else had he hidden from me? And more importantly, why had he specifically left me this property that, according to his own words, was worth more than the fortune of $15 million that my fake son had inherited? Because something told me the biggest secrets were still to be discovered. By the third day in the shack, I could no longer sleep. Not because of the cold or the discomfort of the dirt floor, but because my mind would not stop spinning around everything I had discovered. Arthur Harrison, not Morris. A woman named Mary Ellen, a son who was not mine. How many more lies had I lived without knowing? That morning, I decided it was time to dig deeper. If Arthur had left me this property for a specific reason, I had the right to know what that reason was. I went back to the shed, and this time I checked every corner like a detective. I moved boxes, lifted floorboards, tapped on the walls, looking for hollow spaces. Nothing. But when I was about to give up, something caught my attention. On the ground, under where the desk had been, there were strange marks in the dirt, as if something heavy had been there for a long time, leaving a rectangular imprint. I knelt down and started digging with my bare hands. The dirt was loose, too loose to have been like that for years. About 8 inches deep, my fingers touched something hard, wood. With my heart beating like a drum, I kept digging until I discovered a wooden box the size of a small suitcase. It was sealed with wax and had a small padlock that I managed to break with an old hammer I found among the tools. When I lifted the lid, the air escaped from my lungs. Inside, there were bundles of documents perfectly organized in colored folders, photographs, and something that made me tremble. Bills. Lots of American bills in denominations of $100. I took the first folder labeled in Arthur's handwriting, St. Helen Mining Corp., original contracts. I started reading, and with every line my world shook more. The documents showed that Arthur was not an employee of an insurance office as he had told me for 40 years. He was a founding partner and owner of 60% of a mining company that extracted gold and silver in these mountains. According to the papers, the St. Helen mine had been founded in 1978 by 4 partners: Arthur Harrison, 60%, Edward Vance, 25%, Charles Mendoza, 10%, and Raymond Towers, 5%. The contracts were signed, sealed, and notarized, but that was not all. There were more recent documents showing the annual profits of the mine. The figures made me dizzy. $8 million in 2020, $12 million in 2021, $15 million in 2022, and according to a valuation report dated just last year, the total value of the company was $47 million. $47 million. My hands started shaking so much that I almost dropped the papers. Robert had inherited $15 million, thinking it was the entire fortune, but it turns out the true wealth was worth more than triple that. I looked for more documents. There was a different will than the one Attorney Miller had read. This one had a more recent date and clearly said, "I leave the entirety of my shares in St. Helen Mining Corp. to my legitimate wife, Evelyn Morris Harrison, as compensation for the years of deceit and as protection against those who might claim rights that do not belong to them. Legitimate wife protection against those who might claim rights." What was Arthur talking about? In another folder, I found the answer. It was labeled Private Investigation, Mary Ellen Sanchez. Inside were photographs of a beautiful dark-haired woman about 50 years old. In one of the photos, she was leaving an elegant house in an upscale neighborhood. In another, getting into a Mercedes-Benz. And in the most recent one, dated just 3 months before Arthur's death, she was entering a law office together with Robert. My son, who had screamed at me. Useless old woman was entering a law firm with the woman who had been his father's mistress. There were more photographs. Robert and Mary Ellen having lunch at expensive restaurants. Robert and Mary Ellen in meetings with men in suits. And the most devastating of all, Robert hugging Mary Ellen the way only a son hugs his mother. On the back of that photo in Arthur's handwriting, it said Robert always knew who his real mother was. Evelyn was just the nanny I paid to raise him. My soul shattered into 1,000 pieces. The nanny he paid, I had just been an employee for 40 years, without knowing it. I kept reviewing the documents with tears in my eyes. There were reports from a private investigator Arthur had hired to follow Robert and Mary Ellen. According to these reports, mother and son had been seeing each other in secret for the last 5 years. They were planning something. The last report, dated just a month before Arthur's death, said I confirm that Robert Harrison Sanchez and Mary Ellen Sanchez are conspiring with the attorney Patricia Miller to hide the existence of the St. Helen mine. They have falsified documents to make it appear that Mr. Harrison's total assets consist only of urban properties and bank accounts totaling $15 million. Their objective is to completely exclude Mrs. Evelyn from the multi-million-dollar inheritance. Attorney Miller, the same one who had read me the fake will, the same one who had looked at me with pity when Robert screamed at me. She was involved in the fraud, but there was more. In the bottom of the box, I found another document that froze my blood, a personal letter from Arthur addressed to me dated a week before his death. My dearest Evelyn, if you are reading this, it is because you have already discovered the truth. I know you will hate me, and you have every right to do so. I lied to you for 40 years, but not out of malice, but out of cowardice. Mary Ellen was my girlfriend when we were young. She got pregnant with Robert, but I was already engaged to you because my family approved of our marriage. In those times, a man could not have children out of wedlock without ruining his reputation. So I proposed an arrangement to Mary Ellen. I would take care of the child financially forever, but he would be raised with you as if he were yours. She accepted because she needed the money, and you were so good, so pure, that I knew you would love Robert as if he had come from your own womb. But I made a terrible mistake. I never told Robert the truth about our arrangement. I let Mary Ellen tell him her version of the story, where you were the villain who had stolen me from her, and where he was the legitimate son who deserved my entire fortune. Robert grew up hating you without you knowing it. For him, you are the woman who destroyed his real family. For Mary Ellen, you are the obstacle she has to remove to claim what she considers hers. That is why I leave you the mine, Evelyn. It is my way of compensating you for a life of lies. With those 47 million, you will be able to live like the queen you always should have been. And when Robert and Mary Ellen come for more money, because they will come, I assure you, you will have the power to decide if you forgive them or if you teach them that they underestimated the wrong woman. In the box, you will also find the evidence of their conspiracy to rob you. Use it wisely. I loved you in my cowardly way, but I loved you. Arthur Harrison. I stayed there, sitting on the dirt floor, surrounded by documents that were worth a fortune, crying for everything I had lost and for everything I had just gained. 40 years being the mother of a son who hated me. 40 years being the wife of a man who lied to me. 40 years giving my life for a family that was a farce. But now I knew the truth, and the truth had turned me into a multi-millionaire. Robert had inherited 15 million, thinking he had left me on the street to starve. But it turns out I had just inherited 47 million, and the proof that he and his real mother had conspired to rob me. The question was, what was I going to do with all that power? Because one thing I had learned in those 3 days of solitude: when a 67-year-old woman has nothing left to lose, she becomes very, very dangerous. And Robert was about to discover exactly how dangerous the useless old woman he had underestimated could be. I spent the whole night awake, reading and rereading every document, every photograph, every proof of the monumental lie I had lived in for 40 years. But there was one letter I had not read completely, one that was at the bottom of the last folder. When I took it out and saw the header, what remained of my heart broke. To my son Robert, the truth about your adoptive mother. With trembling hands, I read the words Arthur had written for the son I had raised as mine. Robert, my son, the time has come for you to know the whole truth, whole. Evelyn is not your biological mother, you already know that. But what you do not know is that she never knew you were not her son. When your real mother, Mary Ellen, got pregnant, I was already engaged to Evelyn. My family had arranged the marriage because she came from a respectable family, although poor. In those times, canceling an engagement would have been a scandal. So I made a deal with Mary Ellen. I would take care of all your expenses forever, but you would be raised with Evelyn and me as if you were our biological son. I told Evelyn that she had lost an early pregnancy due to shock, and when you arrived a month later, she received you as the miracle she had prayed for so much. Evelyn loved you from the first second, Robert. She fed you with formula as if it were her own milk. She stayed up all night when you had a fever. She sold her wedding jewelry to pay for your college. She worked cleaning other people's houses when my business went through a crisis so that you would not lack anything. She sacrificed her dreams of being a teacher to raise you. She rejected suitors when she was widowed young. Yes, son, I died when you were 10 years old, but that is another story that does not matter right now. Evelyn gave you a complete mother's life without knowing that I paid Mary Ellen monthly to stay away. Robert, your mom. Evelyn, as you called her when you were little, deserves your respect and your love. She is not to blame for my lies. I dropped the letter as if it burned my hands. Arthur had died when Robert was 10 years old, but I clearly remembered living with him until 6 months ago when he died of cancer. What was he talking about? I looked for more documents, more photographs, more clues, and what I found left me without air in my lungs. There were death certificates, 2 death certificates for the same man with different names. The first one, Arthur Harrison deceased, March 15, 1995, cause of death car accident. The second one, Arthur Morris deceased, September 6, 2024, cause of death lung cancer. Same man, same photograph, same fingerprints according to the attached medical reports, but different identities, different dates of death. With shaking hands, I looked for more explanations. I found them in a folder marked Operation Second Chance, Confidential Documents. Arthur had faked his death in 1995 to escape debts with dangerous people related to the mine. He had used corrupt contacts to create a new identity, Arthur Morris. During 30 years, he had lived as 2 different people, as Arthur Harrison, the rich miner, who visited his son Robert and his ex-mistress Mary Ellen in secret, supporting them financially and promising them that one day they would inherit everything. And as Arthur Morris, the modest insurance employee, married to Evelyn, living a quiet middle-class life. I had been married to a ghost for 30 years, a man who divided his time, his money and his heart between 2 families who did not know of the other's existence. But the most painful part was still to come. In the last pages of the file, I found transcripts of phone conversations Arthur had recorded in secret conversations between Robert and Mary Ellen, planning what to do after his death. Robert: Mom, when Arthur dies, we have to make sure that old woman doesn't find out about the mine. The $15 million she is going to inherit is already too much for someone like her. Mary Ellen: Relax, son. Attorney Miller is already fixing the papers. Officially, the St. Helen mine does not exist, and if Evelyn asks why Arthur left her that horrible shack, we will tell her it was a sentimental whim. Robert: Perfect. When we have all the money, we can live like the family we were always meant to be. You, me, and maybe even my future children without that woman getting in the way. Mary Ellen: Robert's son, you have to promise me something. When we get Arthur's money, I do not want you to feel sorry for Hope. She had 40 years of living a happy lie. We deserve our chance. Robert, do not worry, Mom. That woman never meant anything to me. She was just the maid Dad hired to take care of me. She fulfilled her purpose. The recording continued, but I could not listen anymore. I took off the headphones and stayed there sitting on the floor, feeling as if my heart had been ripped out in pieces. She was just the maid Dad hired to take care of me. Those words repeated in my mind like a nightmare. 40 years of unconditional love, of sleepless nights, when he had a fever, of working double shifts, to buy him the sneakers he wanted, of applauding at every school event, of consoling him when girlfriends broke his heart. All that had been for him the work of a maid. I remembered the night Robert graduated from college. I had saved for months to buy him a new suit. When I saw him go up on stage to receive his diploma, I cried with pride. After the ceremony, he hugged me and said, "Thank you, Mom. Without you, none of this would have been possible." Lie. It had all been a lie. I remembered when Robert married Patricia. I had organized the whole wedding. I had hand-embroidered the tablecloth for the altar, and I had cooked for 100 guests. In his speech, Robert had said thanks to my mother Hope for teaching me what true love is. More lies. He knew perfectly well who his real mother was. I remembered when Patricia left him for another man. Robert came home crying like a child, and I stayed up all night hugging him, telling him he would find someone better. He had told me, "Mom, you are the only woman who is never going to betray me." The irony burned my soul. I was the only one who had never betrayed him, but he had been betraying me for years. In that moment, I understood why Arthur had left me all that documentation. It was not just so I would know the truth about the money. It was so I would know the truth about the son to whom I had given my entire life. Robert was not an ungrateful son who had lost his way. Robert was a conspirator who had planned my destruction for years. With the help of his real mother and a corrupt lawyer, they had orchestrated the perfect robbery, making me believe I was left on the street with nothing while they split a fortune that was legally mine. But Arthur had been smarter than all of them. He had documented every lie, every conspiracy, every betrayal, and he had left me the weapons to defend myself. The problem was that I no longer knew if I wanted to defend myself or if I simply wanted to disappear. For 67 years, I had believed I was a woman, loved by her family. Now I was discovering that I had been an unpaid employee, a useful fool, a woman so naive that she had raised her husband's lover's son without even suspecting it. How does a person recover from a betrayal so deep? How does a woman get up after just discovering that her whole life was a lie? That night, surrounded by documents that turned me into a multimillionaire, I cried like I had never cried in my life. I was not crying for the lost money or the stolen inheritance. I was crying for the 40 years of love I had given without receiving anything real in return. I was crying for the naive woman I had been and could never be again. But between one tear and another, something started to change inside me. A strange force, a cold rage I had never felt before. Robert and Mary Ellen had made a fatal mistake. They had underestimated the wrong woman. Because if there is one thing a deceived mother does not forgive, it is discovering that the son to whom she gave all her love considered her just a maid, and they were about to learn that this maid had just become their worst nightmare. After crying all night, I woke up with a strange determination. I was no longer the naive Hope who had arrived at this cabin a week ago. The pain had done something to me. It had hardened me like clay in the sun. If Robert and Mary Ellen wanted to play dirty, I was going to teach them how to play for real. I went back to read every letter from Arthur, this time looking for clues I had overlooked before. In one of them, he mentioned the true treasure is not in the banks nor in the urban properties. It is where everything began, under the land that saw us born. Under the land, was he referring literally to something buried here on the property? I went out of the cabin and started walking the grounds with new eyes. Arthur had said this land was worth more than the $15 million Robert inherited. I already knew about the $47 million from the mine, but there was something about that phrase that unsettled me. Where everything began. What exactly had begun here? I remembered the conversation with Mr. Wilson at the convenience store. He had said this property belonged to the Harrison family for generations. And what if Arthur had not just been a partner in the mine, but the heir to a much older family fortune? I went back to the shed, and this time I examined every inch of the place. In a corner behind some rusty tools, I found something that made me stop. A floorboard that sounded hollow when I hit it with my foot. With a hammer and an old screwdriver, I managed to lift the board. Underneath, there was a hole that seemed to be the entrance to a tunnel. My heart started beating like crazy. A tunnel. Why would Arthur want a secret tunnel underneath this abandoned cabin? I took a flashlight I had bought in town and gathered my courage. At 67 years old, getting into an underground tunnel seemed like madness, but I had already come too far to turn back. The tunnel was deeper than I expected. I went down some stone steps carved into the rock, and after walking about 20 yards in the dark, I arrived at a wooden door reinforced with metal. It had an old lock, but the key was hanging from a nail on the side. Arthur had planned everything. When I opened that door, I could not believe what my eyes were seeing. It was a complete room excavated in the rock, like an artificial cave. The walls were covered with metal shelves full of safety deposit boxes, filing cabinets, and in the center, a large table with more documents than I had seen in my life. But what really took my breath away were the back walls. They were covered with old maps, framed certificates, and photographs showing the complete history of the Harrison family. In one of the oldest photographs from the beginning of the 20th century, there appeared a man who looked a lot like Arthur next to other miners. On the back it said, "Grandfather Jack Harrison, founder of the first gold mine in the region, 1901. Arthur had not just been a partner in a mine. He was the heir to a mining empire that had been in his family for more than 100 years. I went straight to the central table and found what Arthur had called his true will. This document was dated just a week before his death and had been registered with a different notary than the one Attorney Miller had used. I read every line carefully. I, Arthur Harrison, in full use of my mental faculties, leave the entirety of my assets to my legitimate wife, Hope Harrison. This includes the shares of St. Helen Mining Incorporated, valued at $47 million, the rural properties in Montana, Wyoming, and Colorado, valued at $23 million, the bank accounts in Switzerland for $18 million, and the investments in physical gold stored in this chamber for an approximate value of $31 million. My eyes blurred. Physical gold, $31 million in gold. I looked toward the safety deposit boxes on the shelves and understood why Arthur had built this underground chamber. I opened the first box with trembling hands. Inside were bars of pure gold, each one marked with the seal of the St. Helen Mining Company. There were dozens of identical boxes. The will continued. Robert Harrison, biological son of Mary Ellen, will receive no inheritance whatsoever due to his proven participation in a conspiracy to defraud my legitimate wife. The proofs of said conspiracy are attached to this document. And yes, there were all the proofs. Photographs of Robert and Mary Ellen meeting with Attorney Miller, audio recordings, where they planned to hide the existence of the mine copies of the forged documents they had presented as the true will. But there was more. Arthur had hired not only a private investigator, but a complete security firm to document every movement of the conspirators. He had videos, photographs, call logs, bank movements, everything. In a folder marked Contingency Plan, I found the exact instructions Arthur had left for me. Hope when you discover this chamber, you will have understood that your life was a lie, but also that now you have the power to write your own truth. In this room, there are documents proving that Robert and Mary Ellen conspired to steal $119 million from you, the total sum of all my real assets. I leave you three options. 1, take the money and disappear, living the rest of your life in peace and abundance far from them. 2, publicly expose the conspiracy and send Robert and Mary Ellen to jail for fraud. 3, play their same game but play it better than them. Whichever you choose, remember that you are no longer the naive woman who raised Robert. Now you are Hope Harrison, heir to an empire of $119 million, and owner of secrets that can destroy or save the people who betrayed you. $119 million. 119 million American dollars. Robert had inherited 15 million, believing he had left me on the street, when in reality I had just become the owner of a fortune 8 times larger than his. But it was not just the money that had changed me, it was the power. The power to decide the destiny of the people who had planned my destruction. The power to choose between being a victim or being a judge. I stayed there, sitting in that underground chamber surrounded by gold and documents, feeling my old personality vanish like smoke. The Hope who had arrived at this cabin crying and humiliated no longer existed. In her place, someone new had been born, someone who knew exactly how much she was worth and how much power she had, someone who was no longer going to allow herself to be underestimated ever again. Robert had screamed at me, "Die alone there, you useless old woman," thinking he was condemning me to misery. But in reality, without knowing it, he had freed me from the chains of a fake family to turn me into the most powerful woman in his life. And now I had to decide what to do with all that power. Because one thing was clear, the war between us was just beginning. And this time, I had all the weapons. During the following days, something extraordinary happened to me. I no longer cried, I no longer lamented. It was as if I had woken up from a 40-year dream to discover I had superpowers. Because that was exactly what I had, $119 million information that could destroy the lives of those who had betrayed me. But I was not a vengeful woman by nature. During my whole life, I had been one of those who forgive, one of those who forget, one of those who turn the other cheek. However, this situation had awakened something primitive in me, something I did not even know existed. I spent the first week organizing all of Arthur's documents as if I were a professional detective. I separated the evidence by categories: conspiracy, fraud, document forgery, concealment of assets. Each folder was a bomb that could explode in the hands of Robert and Mary Ellen whenever I decided. But before acting, I needed updated information. What were they doing now that they believed they had beaten me? How were they spending the money they thought they had legally stolen? I hired the services of the same private investigator who had worked for Arthur Mr. Reynolds, a man of about 50, discreet as a shadow and efficient as a Swiss watch. When I showed him part of the documentation, I had his eyes lit up. Mrs. Harrison, he told me, and I liked hearing my true last name. This is the most complete fraud case I have seen in my career. With this evidence, we could send not only your son and Mary Ellen to prison, but also Attorney Miller. I do not want to send them to prison yet, I replied with a calm that surprised even me. First, I want to know exactly what they have done with the fake inheritance money. I want to know every movement, every purchase, every luxury they have given themselves with my money. Sometimes the best revenge is letting the enemy hang themselves with their own rope. And I was right. The reports he handed me a week later were more revealing than I had imagined. Robert had not wasted time. In the 2 months since the reading of the fake, he had spent $3.2 million on what could only be described as a millionaire playboy life. He had bought a penthouse on the Upper East Side for $1.8 million. He had acquired a Lamborghini for $400,000. He had gone on vacation to Dubai with a model he had met on Instagram, spending $200,000 on the trip. And the most painful thing of all, he had organized a freedom party at the family mansion, where he publicly celebrated having freed himself from the burden of his adoptive mother. The photographs of that party split my soul and filled me with a cold rage I had never felt. Robert appeared hugging Mary Ellen, introducing her to everyone as my true mother, the woman who can finally be proud of her son. He had hired bands, served the most expensive wines, and invited all the high society of the city to celebrate my supposed disappearance from his life. But what really made me clench my fists was a photograph where Robert appeared burning my personal things in the mansion's garden. My photos, my books, the shawl I had inherited from my grandmother, all turned to ashes while he laughed with his guests. Look how easy it is to erase 40 years of a fake life, he had said, according to the witnesses the investigator had interviewed. However, there was more information that would serve my plans. Robert had started betting large sums in Las Vegas casinos. In just 1 month, he had lost $800,000. He had gambling debts that were beginning to pressure him. His model girlfriend had left him when she found out he had financial problems. Mary Ellen, for her part, had not been any smarter. She had moved into a mansion even more ostentatious than Robert's. She had hired luxury domestic staff and was planning a 6-month trip through Europe that would cost more than $500,000. Attorney Miller had received her share of the loot, $2 million for her illegal services, which she had invested in properties in her children's names to hide the origin of the money. But here came the most interesting part. The three of them were starting to fight among themselves. Robert accused Mary Ellen of spending too much. Mary Ellen complained to Robert that he had not officially included her in the inheritance. And Attorney Miller was pressuring both of them to pay her an extra bonus because, according to her, the work had been more complicated than expected. The thieves were fighting over the loot. It was perfect. During those weeks of investigation, I had done something else. I had learned to be rich. I hired a trusted financial advisor who helped me discreetly move part of my assets. I opened bank accounts in my true name. I liquidated some gold investments to have cash available. I also changed my appearance completely. I got a modern haircut. I bought elegant but discreet clothes. I learned to apply makeup in a more sophisticated way. When I looked in the mirror, I no longer saw the humble lady who had arrived crying at this cabin. I saw a powerful woman who knew exactly how much she was worth. But the most important change was not physical, it was mental. I had developed a strategic patience that surprised me. For 40 years I had reacted to everything with my heart. Now I thought with the cold head of a businesswoman managing an empire of 119 million. One night, while reviewing the last reports from the investigator, I made my final decision. It was no longer just about justice. It was about teaching a lesson that Robert, Mary Ellen, and Attorney Miller would never forget. I was going to play their same game, but I was going to play it much better than them. The plan I designed was as elegant as it was devastating. I was not going to appear as the crying victim they remembered. I was going to appear as the most powerful woman in their lives, with evidence that could send them to prison or ruin their reputations forever. But before executing my plan, I was going to give them a chance at redemption, a single chance to acknowledge their mistakes, ask me for sincere forgiveness, and try to repair the damage they had caused. If they took it, I would consider the possibility of being merciful. If they did not take it well, then they would learn the hard way what happens when you underestimate the wrong woman. Because there was something Robert never understood in all these years. I was not just the woman who had raised him. I was the woman who had taught him everything he knew about life. And if he had learned to be manipulative and cruel, it was because he had a very good teacher for 40 years. Only now the student was about to surpass the master. The moment of truth had arrived. It was time to return to the city and face my dear son with the reality of what he had done. And when I did, he would discover that the useless old woman had just become his worst nightmare. Saturday, December 15th, I marked on my calendar as the day of truth. I had spent 2 months planning this moment with the precision of a surgeon. Robert was organizing another of his ostentatious parties at the family mansion, celebrating his new year as a free man and millionaire, according to the invitation the investigator had obtained for me. How ironic he was going to celebrate his freedom on the very day he would lose everything. I dressed in a black suit I had made especially for the occasion. Elegant, sober, but with the authority of a woman who manages empires. I put on the pearl earrings Arthur had given me on our first anniversary, the same ones I thought lost forever when Robert burned my belongings. I had recovered them from the safe in the secret chamber. When I looked at myself in the mirror that morning, I smiled for the first time in months. The woman looking back at me was no longer Hope the victim. It was Hope Harrison, owner of $119 million and master of the destiny of those who had betrayed her. I arrived at the family mansion at 8 in the evening when the party was at its peak. The same garden where I had planted roses for decades was now full of people I did not know. drinking French champagne that cost more than what I used to spend on food for a month. The doorman, who had been our employee for 15 years, recognized me immediately despite my transformation. "Mrs. Hope," he murmured with eyes wide, "but we thought that you had died." I answered him with a smile he did not know how to interpret. "No, Joe. I was just taking care of some pending business. Could you let Robert know his mother is here?" The poor man stood paralyzed. "Ma'am, young Robert gave specific orders that you not—" "Joe," I interrupted him with a soft but firm voice, "I think Robert is going to want to see me, especially when he knows what I have come to talk to him about." I walked toward the main garden without waiting for an answer. The heels of my new shoes resonated on the marble like war drums. The music gradually faded as the guests recognized me. The whispers started like waves. "Isn't that Mrs. Hope? I thought she had disappeared. What is she doing here?" But I walked straight toward where Robert was having his arm around Mary Ellen and laughing with a group of young businessmen. He was wearing a tuxedo that cost more than a teacher's annual salary, and on his wrist shone a new Rolex worth $80,000. When he saw me, the glass of champagne fell from his hands and shattered against the floor. What are you doing here?" He stuttered, and for the first time in months I saw fear in his eyes. "Hello, Robert," I told him with the calmest voice I could find. "Hello, Mary Ellen, what a beautiful party. It reminds me of the ones I organized here for 40 years. Mary Ellen went pale as paper. It was the first time I saw her in person, and I have to admit I understood why Arthur had fallen in love with her. She was beautiful, elegant with that kind of beauty that money can maintain but cannot create. You cannot be here," Robert told me, recovering some composure. "This is no longer your house. I kicked you out of here." "You kicked me out?" I asked him, tilting my head as if I did not understand. "With what right, son?" The word son I pronounced as if it were poison in my mouth, and Robert realized it. "With the right given to me by being the owner of this house," he replied, puffing out his chest. "I inherited everything legally. You have no right to anything." The guests were forming a circle around us like spectators at a boxing match. Some were recording with their phones. Perfect. I wanted witnesses to what was about to happen. "Legally?" I smiled and pulled out of my purse a leather folder I had brought especially for this moment. "Are you referring to this fake will you fabricated with your real mother and Attorney Miller?" Robert turned the color of candle wax. Mary Ellen took a step back as if I were contagious. "I don't know what you are talking about," Robert murmured, but his voice no longer had the arrogance from before. "You don't know what I'm talking about." I opened the folder and took out the first document. "Then let me refresh your memory. This is the true will of Arthur Harrison, registered with Public Notary, number 47 of the city, 1 week before his death." The whispers from the audience intensified. Robert tried to snatch the papers from me, but I moved them out of his reach. "Here it says, clearly," I continued reading out loud, "that Arthur Harrison leaves the entirety of his assets, including St. Helen Mining Incorporated, valued at $47 million, the rural properties for $23 million, the accounts in Switzerland for $18 million, and the investments in gold for $31 million to his legitimate wife, Hope Harrison." The silence that followed was so deep you could hear the wind moving the leaves of the trees. That is impossible," stammered Robert. "Dad didn't have those assets. We checked everything." "Everything?" I took out another document. "Did you also check these private investigation reports where your conspiracy with Mary Ellen and Attorney Miller to hide the real assets of the inheritance is documented?" Mary Ellen was now visibly trembling. "Robert, let's get out of here right now." "Not so fast," I told them, and my voice hardened like steel. "We haven't gotten to the best part yet." I took out the thickest folder full of photographs. These are the proofs that the three of you forged documents, bribed officials, and conspired to steal $119 million from me. $119 million. When I said that figure, some guests gasped audibly. But what hurts me the most, I continued, and here my voice broke a little. It is not the money. It is discovering that for 40 years I raised as my own son someone who always knew I was not his mother, who considered me just the maid Dad hired to take care of him. Robert turned red as a tomato. He knew exactly what I was referring to. It is also discovering that while I cried believing I had lost my only son, you were organizing parties to celebrate having freed yourself from the burden of your adoptive mother. I took out the photographs from his previous party, where he appeared burning my belongings. I showed them to the guests, who now looked at him with a mixture of horror and fascination. And it is also discovering, I continued relentlessly, that you spent $3.2 million of my money on luxuries, while you believed you had condemned me to starve to death in an abandoned cabin. Robert could no longer speak. He had realized that I knew everything, absolutely everything. But do you know what, Robert? I said to him, approaching until I was face to face with him. Arthur knew you better than you knew yourself. He knew you were capable of betraying me, and that is why he left me not only the proofs of your betrayal, but also the tools to decide your fate. I took out the final document, the one I had saved for the last moment. With these papers, I can send you to prison for fraud. I can take away everything you stole, including this house. I can ruin Mary Ellen's reputation and send Attorney Miller to jail. Robert collapsed into one of the garden chairs, completely defeated. But I continued. Arthur also taught me something about forgiveness. So I am going to give you a chance, a single chance, to redeem yourself. The garden was so quiet you could hear the guests breathing. If right now, in front of all these witnesses, you ask me for sincere forgiveness for what you did to me, if you publicly acknowledge that you robbed and betrayed me, and if you promise to pay back every penny you spent of my money working honestly to pay it, then I will consider the possibility of not ruining your life completely. Robert looked at me with tears in his eyes. For a moment I saw the little boy I had raised, the one who cried when he had nightmares, and asked me to sing him to sleep. But then he looked at Mary Ellen, who gave him an almost imperceptible signal, with her head a signal that meant, "Do not give in." Robert stood up, wiped his tears, and looked at me with the same coldness as that night in Attorney Miller's office. "You are nobody to give me chances," he told me with a broken but defiant voice. "You are not my real mother. You never were." In that moment, something broke definitely inside me, not my heart. That was already broken. The last hope that the boy I had raised was still alive somewhere inside that cruel man broke. I put all the documents back in my bag and smiled, a smile that froze the blood. "All right, Robert, you decided." I turned around toward the guests, many of whom were still recording with their phones. "Ladies and gentlemen, you have been witnesses to how Robert Harrison has just rejected the only opportunity for salvation I was going to give him." I looked back at Robert for the last time. "Starting tomorrow, Monday, you are going to start receiving the lawsuits. Fraud, conspiracy, forgery of documents. They are also going to seize everything you bought with my money. The penthouse, the Lamborghini, the jewelry, everything." My voice hardened until it sounded like a judge pronouncing a sentence. "And as for this house, Robert, dear son, that I never was, you have 72 hours to vacate my mansion, because it turns out that according to the real documents, this property also belongs to me." Robert collapsed completely. Mary Ellen started to cry, but I was done. I headed toward the exit with the elegance of a queen who has just recovered her throne. At the door I stopped and addressed Robert one last time. Oh, and by the way, when you wonder how a useless old woman could defeat you so completely, remember that you yourself taught me how cruel a family can be when they decide to betray you. And with those words, I left the family mansion for the last time as a visitor. The next time I entered would be as the legitimate owner to recover what had always been mine. The following 3 months were a hurricane of justice that swept away everything in its path. My lawyers, the best that $119 million can buy, moved like a perfectly coordinated army. The lawsuit against Robert, Mary Ellen, and attorney Miller was filed simultaneously in 3 different courts. Aggravated fraud, conspiracy forgery of documents, bribery of public officials. The evidence was so overwhelming that the judges had no other option than to issue immediate seizure orders. In 72 hours, as I had promised Robert, everything he had bought with my money was confiscated. The penthouse seized, the Lamborghini impounded, the jewelry, the watches, even the expensive clothes he had bought, everything ended up in the hands of the authorities. But the most satisfying thing was seeing how his world of lies crumbled. The newspapers covered the case as the fraud of the decade. Social media filled with memes about the ungrateful son who stole from his mother. The videos of the confrontation at the party went viral, and Robert became the symbol of everything wrong with modern families. Mary Ellen, for her part, did not resist the pressure. As soon as she realized she could go to prison for several years, she decided to cooperate with the authorities. She confessed everything. How she had manipulated Robert since he was a child to hate me. How she had planned for years to take over Arthur's fortune. How she had corrupted attorney Miller. Her confession was devastating for Robert. Discovering that his own biological mother had used him as a pawn in her game of greed broke him completely. In less than a week, he went from being an arrogant millionaire to a man without money, without a house, without a job, and without the maternal image he had idolized for years. Attorney Miller tried to flee the country but was arrested at the airport. The $2 million she had stolen were confiscated and her professional license canceled forever. But getting revenge did not give me the satisfaction I had expected. During the nights alone in my new mansion in the exclusive district, I had bought one even more beautiful than the family one. I felt empty. I had won the war, but I had lost something I could never recover: the innocence of believing in the unconditional love of family. It was then that I remembered Arthur's final words in one of his letters. True power is not in destroying those who hurt you, but in deciding when to stop hurting. One day, 3 months after the confrontation, I received an unexpected call. It was Robert. Hope his voice sounded broken, humble. Could you come see me? I need to talk to you." I found him in a small apartment in a working-class area of the city. The contrast with his previous life was brutal. A room, a bed, a table, and 2 chairs. Nothing else. When he opened the door, I could not recognize the man he had been. He had lost weight, had deep circles under his eyes, and his hands trembled slightly. But for the first time in years, there was no arrogance in his look. Only pain and something that took me time to identify. Genuine remorse. "Thanks for coming," he told me, and his voice broke. "I know I do not deserve for you to even speak to me." We sat face to face in those 2 cheap chairs, and for the first time in 40 years, Robert spoke to me with total honesty. "I do not even know where to start asking for forgiveness," he began, and tears started rolling down his cheeks. "Discovering that Mary Ellen manipulated me since I was a child is no excuse for what I did to you. I knew you were a good mother. I knew you loved me for real. And even so, I chose to hurt you because it was easier to blame you than to face the truth about my biological family." I stayed quiet, letting him continue. "These months with nothing have taught me who I really am when they take away all the luxuries. And the truth is, I am a man who betrayed the only person who loved me unconditionally for 40 years. Robert stood up and knelt in front of me, like when he was a little boy and had done some mischief. "Hope, Mom, because you were my mom, the only real mother I had. Could you give me a chance to be the son you always deserved to have?" For the first time in months, I cried. Not from pain, but from something similar to relief. The boy I had raised was still alive somewhere inside that broken man. Robert, I told him, touching his hair like when he had nightmares. Forgiveness is not something you ask for once it is something you earn day by day with actions. Anything he answered me, I will do whatever is necessary. That afternoon, I proposed a deal. I would not return his stolen inheritance that was lost forever, but I would give him the chance to earn my respect again. You are going to work, you are going to deposit a part of your salary to me, not to pay me the stolen money, but to learn the value of work. And on weekends, you are going to come with me to help on a special project. Robert accepted without asking what the project was. 6 months later, we were inaugurating the Hope Community Center on the land where the abandoned cabin in the mountains had been. With a part of my fortune, I had built a school, a medical center, and trade workshops for the families of the region. Robert worked there on weekends as a carpentry teacher teaching at-risk youth, the trade he had learned during his time without money. He was no longer the arrogant man who had screamed at me, "Useless old woman." He was someone who understood the value of respect, of honest work, and of the second chance that life sometimes gives us. Did I forgive him completely? That is something that continues to be built day by day. But I learned that the true treasure Arthur had left me was not the $119 million. It was the opportunity to choose who I wanted to be when I had all the power of the world in my hands. I chose to be a woman who uses her strength to build, not just to destroy. A woman who understands that real family is not defined by blood, but by the love and respect that are built day by day. And I chose to be a mother who gives second chances but never third ones. Because in the end, the most powerful justice is not the one that destroys our enemies, but the one that transforms them into better people. Robert screamed at me that I would die alone like a useless old woman. But it turns out I became a woman who will never be alone because she is surrounded by a new family, the hundreds of children, youth, and adults who have found hope in the center I built with the love he rejected. And that, believe me, is the sweetest revenge of all. Have you ever felt used by the very family you love the most? Write in the comments. I deserve respect. If this confession touched your heart like it, share it with someone who needs to hear that it is never too late to set boundaries. And subscribe, because I will continue sharing stories of women who discovered their true value when it seemed they had lost everything.